Hey everyone, welcome and thank you for attending Carolina Farm Stewardship Association's 36th Annual Sustainable Agriculture Conference. You have joined Managing Soil Health in High Tunnels with Dr. Janel Ohletz. I want to welcome you to this session. My name is Gina Moore. I will be the host for this session. I am CFSA's Organic Research Coordinator. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box as we go through here. Also, if you have any questions for the presenter, you can put those in the chat box and we'll try to stop and go through and ask and answer questions during the presentation and at the end. I encourage people to have conversations in the chat box. Feel free to talk to each other throughout this presentation. We highly encourage that. We also want to thank our session sponsor, Whole Foods Market. They have been a huge sponsor for this workshop, so we really appreciate that. So without further ado, I am going to hand this over to our presenter for this session. Hi, Janelle, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. Janel Ohletz. I am Durham County Cooperative Extension Agent. My focus is small farms and local foods. My background is in sustainable agriculture and food systems, and I have a master's as well in agriculture science, where my focus was on grafting, and I have a PhD in soil science. So I kind of have a very well-rounded, holistic view of the food system. And previous to going back to school to get these sets of degrees, I was a chef for about 20 years. So I really care deeply and passionately about the food system and growing healthy foods. And then I did also grow up on a farm in New Hampshire. So very familiar with how difficult it is sometimes to make things grow the way you hope they would. So without further ado, I will get started on the talk because we have a lot to cover. So my outline for today is really first to set the baseline of where I stand on soil health, sustainable, and regenerative agriculture, just to kind of, because those terms often mean different things, different people. So I like to let people know where I stand on that. Basics of soil properties, because you really need to have that understanding to understand how you work with soil health. The conditions that are unique to us, high tunnel. So there are specific things that you need to take into consideration. And then I will lastly talk about management techniques for high tunnels to deal with the soil health and bring that about. So first, on to soil health. The USDA defines that as the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And it's really focused on that living ecosystem. Although I still have a problem with the fact that they have separated out animals and humans, because the last time I looked at a encyclopedia, animals and humans. We are animals. So if we would not set ourselves apart from the system instead of within the system, we might have avoided some of these issues that we are currently facing. So then we have sustainable agriculture. If you look at it, often a lot of people say it's like a three-legged stool that you kind of fall over if you sit on it if you don't have all three legs in equal balance. So there's this Venn diagram often shown when we talk about sustainable agriculture. You have one section that is the ecology, that is the environment. The other part to that society, that's the community, that's the people that need to eat. And then the economy, because we need to ensure that the farmer who's raising a crop within sustainable agriculture practices is able to sustain themselves as well, and they are making a livable wage. So really where that sustainability part is at the intersection. So when you're making a decision, you need to take into account all three of those legs of that stool in order to be in balance. And that is where sustainability lives. So some things that I like to say is generally you want to take a systems approach. You want to find the balance. And in order to do that, often the best way to do it is focusing on, well, your productivity. You need to ensure that you're being productive, because for sustainable, something to be able to continue to sustain for a long time is it needs to be productive. We're going to have 3 billion plus minus more people on the planet in the next 20 to 30 years. And we're going to need to be able to continually be productive enough to feed them. Although if we, on a completely different note, save the food waste and deal with the food waste, we can probably deal with that as well. That's a very complex issue. Then stewardship. It's really important that we steward the land so it's there and continue to be productive. And be stewards of the environment and our surrounding area, and also ensure that the farmer may want to pass that farm on to the next generation or someone else to take up the helm, and stewarding that land is important. And of course, as I've mentioned, profitability is important because the farmer, if they go out of business, are no longer raising crops to feed the rest of the humanity. So it is important also that we think about that. But lastly, it's important also to think about quality of life. If a farmer just works and works and works just to make ends meet, and they have no quality of life, I would say that that isn't necessarily a sustainable system as well, because they're likely to get sicker sooner. And so it is important to take that into consideration. So then some practices when we're talking about sustainability, often we're talking about integrated pest management, rotating our crops to reduce that disease pressure, managing our water, reducing the soil disturbance that helps to build up that soil organic matter, as well as ensuring we are covering that soil with a cover crop when we're not growing a cash crop. Managing the nutrients really importantly, so that we are reducing the losses of nutrients out into the atmosphere and into the waterways. And then conserving energy on the farm as a way that we can do that, maybe by reducing the need for a lot of heating, by using things like a secondary cover within a high tunnel, or other ways, heat sinks and things like that, to be able to capture some of the natural solar resources. So then moving on to regenerative agriculture. And regenerative agriculture is a term that has yet to be defined, but of an article that I've recently read, had three of interesting definitions, and this particular one by Terra Genesis International in 2020 came up with, I think, a regenerative agriculture definition that at least focuses on a fairly balanced system, although it leaves some parts of there are a few things that it's missing, especially the societal component. But a system of farming principles and practices that increase biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. And generally, a lot of people throw around, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and what's the difference? Well, I like to often say you have two people, person one and person two, and they both look very similar, but one has, it's really healthy, they eat right, they take care of themselves. And then you have the other person that is still functioning, they're going to work, but they're not eating right, they're maybe not getting enough sleep, they're not taking care of themselves as well. In the long run, yes, both of the people are functioning, and often we can say they can sustain themselves. But over the long term, if there is an impact to either one of those individuals, the person that is taking better care of themselves is likely more resilient and can take the impact of something and can then continue to sustain. So sustainability can be at any level of health within a system. So when we're talking about soil health, well, if you don't have soil health, you can continue to sustain that system in the place that it is. So what regenerative agriculture is basically getting at is moving that system up to a position of health, so it is more resilient and it can better withstand an impact. And that is essentially the difference between sustainable and regenerative agriculture. It is improving the soil to a point where it is really going to provide those services and become more in balance, so it reduces the need for inputs. So I'm going to switch to talk a little bit about some of the soil basics that are really important to understand. The biggest thing on this page that I want you to take away from this is soil is dynamic. It means it changes constantly. You can take a soil sample today, it rains, go out, take a soil sample tomorrow, you'll have completely different results that come back from the lab. And that's generally because it's constantly changing. When the moisture level changes, the microbes are slightly differently active. They're releasing more nutrients or less nutrients, and it's constantly shifting. And so it's important to understand that when you look at soil, you're taking a snapshot in time of what is going on below the soil, but know that that isn't like the holy grail of what's going on. If you have heat changes, if you have moisture changes, the soil will change as well, because it is a living ecosystem down below what is living on top. And soil is made up of layers, and the top layer is that organic layer. Then we have the topsoil. That's generally where most of the nutrients are residing and most of the roots are going to be. But we do also have the subsoil, which, if it is curated well and has good tilth and is healthy and happy, those roots will be able to penetrate down into that subsoil and access more nutrients. And there are microbes that will also live in that, because in general, they like to live right around the roots in what's known as the rhizosphere. And then below that is the parent material. Soil is built from the bottom up through multiple processes that are both physical, chemical, and biological. But in general, it takes eons to build soil. So what we want to do is hold on to what we have. And then when I'm talking about soil, there is a physical definition. It's a combination of sand, silt, and clay. Sand is the largest particle. Then we have silt, it's kind of in the middle, and then clay, which is super, super small. And in general, when we talk about these things, it's important to understand the mix of the sand, silt, and clay that you have in the soil on your land, because then that really combination is going to affect the properties and how that soil holds water or how quickly it drains. You know, when you go to the beach and a wave hits, that water quickly is gone. But if it was clay, that water would sit there for quite a while. And then the other thing is also about surface area. If you think about how many little clay particles you can stick in that one particle of sand, and each of that clay particle has a surface all the way around, you can get 6,000 million square meters of clay to 1 square meter of sand. That's what the difference is. It's very large. And so there's a lot more surface area, which means there's a lot more area for the ability for cohesion and adhesion. That's like the sticky part of water. It kind of loves to stick to surfaces. Well, it sticks to clay particles. And so your soil can hold on to a lot more water if you have a lot of clay, which could be good, but it could also be bad if you have too much of it. Then when we look at a healthy soil, this is kind of a representation. If I take a shovel full of soil, what I hope to see within that, if I were to be like a little soil microbe living around in there. 45% of that shovelful will be the minerals. That's that sand, silt, and clay that I just mentioned. And then we have 5% of that, half of the shovel is going to be organic matter. If we lived in the Northeast or somewhere where it was colder. In the Southeast, you are highly unlikely, unless you're in the Blacklands or someone where it's a more of a wetland type soil, where you're going to be able to have a soil organic matter or organic matter of 5%. And that's really just because it's warmer here. The soil microbes are active for longer. They are eating that organic matter. And so it becomes very difficult to build because you're kind of against the tide of the microbes are just able to be active longer. Whereas in like Minnesota or New Hampshire, where I'm from, you can build 10% organic matter just because the microbes are freezing their butts off in the winter. From right about now, they're kind of like dormant, and they stay dormant until about April when it warms up again. And then the other half of that shovelful is really the space between the actual minerals and organic matter. And in that space, for a healthy soil, what we hope is that half of that space is filled with water and the other half is filled with air, because both the roots of the plants as well as the microbes actually need to breathe. So it's important to ensure that it's not completely filled with water, but also if it had no water, the microbes wouldn't move around, they wouldn't be living very well, and neither would your plants, because they wouldn't be able to access any of the nutrients. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on that 5% or thereabouts on organic matter. And I like to define it as the living, the dead, and the very dead. And it is essentially part of a cycle. You know, we have the trees all losing their leaves right now. Those leaves, that organic matter that falls down to the ground, our soil microbes and organisms will help to break down that organic matter that has just been deposited onto the surface of the soil. And then as they break that down, and then one larger organism breaks it down into smaller bits, and then something eats the detritus from that, and then it continues down to the smaller and smaller organisms, and maybe larger organisms eat the smaller organisms. It cycles through, and then eventually what you end up with is nutrients that are released, that plant, if it's actively growing, takes those nutrients up, puts it into its leaves, and then the cycle starts all over again. When we look a little deeper into the soil cycle, or the organic matter cycle, it's pretty complex, but I'm going to walk you through it. I know it's a little bit complex. I'm not sure if you guys can see the arrow on my screen, but we're going to just start at the top on the crop. It says crop, and we're going to go around clockwise. So we have the crop, it's growing, and then it releases its leaves. You've harvested it, but hopefully you've left a little bit of the residues there. And those residues then are going to be broken down by those soil biota. That soil biota is just another fancy word for microorganisms or little tiny critters that live in your soil. They need oxygen, so they're infused with oxygen, and then they decompose that organic matter. But they're also releasing carbon dioxide and water into the soil, which the plant can take up if you have actively growing plants. And through that decomposition, it gets down into humic matter or humus, not to be confused for hummus, which is great on pita chips. So humus is then part of the kind of more dead stuff that can then be eaten by smaller microbes like bacteria and other fungi. They immobilize. Immobilize is basically just locking up those nutrients, and it's mostly because the organism has consumed that and now it's part of its being. And then they may emit some things after they eat, and those are proteins and polysaccharides, fancy words for other parts of broken down material. But the cool thing is some of that actually becomes part of the soil structure through some fulvic and humic acids, fancy words for things that will be sticky and stay around within the soil. And that is often what happens when we talk about carbon sequestration, is when the organic matter really gets locked up and stays in the soil and becomes part of that soil structure hanging around. But if we disturb that, say if we till, then that stuff that's stored there in that lovely savings account can actually get released by the organisms. So then when the organisms die and they decay, they release the nutrients, and that is known as mineralization. So when that happens, now the nutrients are available to be taken up. As long as there is proper water around and a plant that is actively growing, the nutrients are taken back up into the crop, but some of them can also be consumed by other soil biota and organisms that also need those nutrients to grow themselves. So that's essentially the basic cycle of how organic matter kind of moves through the system within the soil. So when we talk about plants, which is what we really care about right now, when we're talking about growing some plants in a high tunnel, is it's important to understand how nutrients are taken up by plants. So there's 3 different ways that plants are able to access nutrients through the soil, or the other way to look at it is how those nutrients move through the soil to be accessed by the roots. First, there is mass flow. That's essentially when a plant is able to kind of take up the water. It's also taking up nutrients. There's certain very mobile nutrients within the soil that easily flow through that water column and are able to be taken up by the plant. And in those black boxes on this slide, you see that I have listed mobile nutrients. And one of the good or bad things about mobile nutrients is they are easily mobile and being able to be taken up by actively growing plants, but they're also easily lost from the system. And in a rain event, they can either leach, or in the case of something like sulfur, often ends up in the subsoil, kind of out of reach of some of the plants. And then we have the immobile nutrients, which don't move as easily through the soil. And so the other 2 ways that a plant can access those nutrients is through diffusion, and that's kind of against what we call an salinity gradient, or an osmotic through osmotic potential. And so the plant is able to kind of control that kind of solution. My brain farting on exactly what, like lost the word. Essentially, you have a gradient of high amounts of, say, we'll call it salts, but it's not really necessarily the exact term. And then you have a low concentration. And nature loves a balance. And so you're going to want to have the thing of high concentration going to the low concentration. That's how that plant's able to pull up as it's continually taking away the nutrients from that low concentration, those high concentration, continually moving over towards that. And then we have root interception. And this is actually where the root actually has to grow over and intercept that particular nutrient. And phosphorus is one of those that is the only way that not the only way. I will cover one other way in a little bit. But in general, if you don't have healthy soil, it's the only way that your plant is going to get phosphorus, is it's going to intercept that. It's growing over to it. So if you don't have phosphorus readily available within, let's say you put in a seedling and up near the top where the roots are, then your plant will be deficient quickly in phosphorus. And then often we talk about, when we're talking about a healthy soil and you take a soil test, what's the biggest thing you're most concerned with is the pH of the soil. And part of the reason why that's important, especially in the East Coast where it rains a lot, and we generally have fairly acid soils, is due to this aluminum toxicity issue. Generally, when you have a pH that is 5.5 or below, it leads to aluminum being high enough in the solution that it is in a form that burns the roots and becomes toxic. So as soon as you bring that pH above 5.5, you then lock up enough of the aluminum, it doesn't become a problem. And this image here on the left-hand side of these roots are corn plants. You can see healthy roots grown in a proper pH with no aluminum toxicity, and the other roots that are actually grown in a fairly toxic environment. And then you see this electron microscope image of a healthy soil in the pair of images on the right-hand side of the slide. And then the one that is on the far right is one that is grown in a aluminum toxic soil or a pH that is below 5.5. If it's highly acid, it can really burn the roots. However, there are some plants, such as blueberries and things that are acid loving, that have adapted and are able to actually function just fine. But in the case of most vegetable plants, if you don't adjust your pH and you have high acid soils, you're going to really have a tough time for the plant to be able to grow. And so it's important to ensure that they have healthy roots so they can access all the nutrients. But how do we deal with this pH? Often, we're talking about liming the soil. And here's this little kind of cartoonish thing that I've created here, talking about how this lime deals with that. So what I have here is a plant growing in a soil. And I have lots of different ions in here. And that little brown blob is a clay particle. And it has lots of negatively charged spaces on it, which attracts all these positively charged ions. I also have some hydrogen molecules because pH is a measure of hydrogen and how much that's in solution. So we have lots of hydrogen molecules there, as well as aluminum, which is kind of toxic. So once I've added the lime, my aluminums move off that clay particle. They become aluminum oxides. And then the other cool thing is the hydrogens actually get converted into carbonic acid. And that is then no longer a problem with just hydrogen ions. That's going to raise the pH. And then the cool thing is because these hydrogen ions have actually moved off the clay particle, they've made spaces where some of the positively charged ions can actually then stay in the soil. They're attracted to that, and they're held there until that plant needs it for later. And so the other reason why pH is really important is also kind of lines up to what the nutrients are available, most amounts of nutrients that are available for the plant. I know this is kind of a crazy diagram. It's lots of bars. Basically what it's showing is each of these nutrients, the main nutrients needed by a plant. And where it's thin, it means it's least available at that particular pH. And down on the bottom of that diagram, we have pH running from 4 all the way up to 10. And then the thicker it is where it is most available at that pH. And it's kind of interesting that most of our plants that like pHs between 5.8 to 6.8 is also where most of these nutrients are in balance and mostly available. So that's why in general, most vegetable plants especially, you like to grow in a 5.8 to 6.8. So importance is first and foremost, take a soil test, do yourself a favor and adjust your pH first, because often that can be the first line of defense in fixing any of your nutrient problems. And one of the important things is to rely on someone who can help ensure that you are adjusting that correctly, because it's important to understand this concept called buffering capacity. And really this diagram is going to quickly kind of show you how that works. And you have 3 different types of soils here. We have a sandy loam, we have a silt loam, and then we have a silt clay loam. And the only thing I really want you to take away from this is understanding the differences between how much lime you need to apply depending on the type of soil you have. If you have, let's say we have our sandy loam and I want to adjust my pH, that is, let's say it's 5.0 to 5.4, which is on the left-hand column, and I want to get it up to a 6. I need to add 45 pounds of limestone per 1,000 square feet. But if I move all the way over to the silt clay loam, I need 115 pounds of limestone per 1,000 square feet. Same adjustment in the pH. It's just having to do with how much clay is actually in the soil. So it is important to understand the clay type or the soil type to be able to make the calculation properly. So often the labs, when they give you that recommendation of lime, they're doing that based off of some chemical analysis, and they determine that. And lastly, talking about pH is really just looking at the effect of leaving residues behind on actually your acidity within the soil. When you leave the residues behind, it actually helps to keep that pH higher. When we're removing removing the residues, it's leading to some acidification. So one more reason why you want to keep some residue behind. Feed the microbes and also reduce the amount of lime you continually have to add. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions before I now go into then just the uniqueness of high tunnels.
So I don't see any questions right now. So I say we go ahead. If anybody has any questions, drop them in the chat box and we'll get to them later.
Okay. So the high tunnel is a protected environment. That's really what makes it so great, because it helps to control kind of things that are out of your control, because I don't think anyone has figured out yet how to control the weather outside. So often the protected agriculture is able to control how much moisture you have on your crop, because you control that instead of the rainfall. The temperature, often you can help control the soil and air temperatures if you are managing that well, using shade cloths in the summer, shutting that down in the winter. And then you can also control some of the organic matter in there, because you can add that within there, as well as the other thing to understand about a high tunnel is often, although we can control some of these things, one thing that generally is difficult to control is salinity. And then the other thing is looking at soil pathogens. Often, because you're growing a crop, often the same crop over and over in the same environment, that can lead to soil pathogens. It's why it's important to understand how you manage your soil within that high tunnel, to understand what you need to do to be able to balance all of these things for a better outcome. And first, talking about soil moisture. First thing, make sure you put that high tunnel in a good spot. If you put it in a low area or an area that generally tends to flood, although it's covered and the rain can't necessarily fall in, it can still kind of find its way in there anyway. And so generally can be a bit of a problem, because now that moisture is within this plastic layer and it's going to have a really tough time getting out because it can't easily evaporate. So ensuring you have good drainage in the spot where you're going to place that high tunnel is very important. But also important is ensuring you have good water holding capacity, because you are going to have to apply the water that is going to be in there through irrigation. And of course, as I have alluded to, water is very important for the availability of nutrients to the plants, because moisture equals nutrient availability. Remember, you have those nutrients that are traveling through the moisture predominantly into the root tip, and that is where those nutrients get into the plant. So it is important to manage your moisture. Oftentimes, when growers come to me and they say, I've given my plant all these nutrients and it just doesn't seem like it's taking them up, often it's because of a moisture issue. Not always, but often. But of course, we're going to go back to that soil texture again and understanding soil texture when we're talking about soil moisture. And when we look at this diagram, we have on the base, we have sandy all the way to clay. And on the side axis, it's percent of soil moisture or soil water that's in there. And it goes all the way up to 35%. And so you have gravity water, just kind of that purpley bluish area. That's essentially the water that would normally, right after rainfall, it's what's called the water that would flow out. So you can see in a sandy soil, the water would easily flow out, and you'd have a lot of it that would leave the system. And that dark blue line is the line at which we'd call field capacity. It's where the field it holds the maximum amount right after all of that water that would normally easily drain off is drained off. And as you can see, sandy soil, well, it'll only hold 5% water at field capacity because the rest is all draining off. And then you go all the way up to clay, and at field capacity, it's at 35%. But yet that's the water that's like held there, a lot of it. But yet if you look on the opposite side of that at clay, the hydroscopic water, that's the water that the plant can't access. And it's at 25% for clay compared to right around 5% for all sand. So the area in the middle, which kind of looks like a slanted eye, that right there, that's the available water. And so how much water is available for your plant and can be stored and held for a short period of time within that soil changes based on the amount or the texture that you have. So essentially how much clay you have in the soil. So if you have really heavy clay soil, in actuality, even though it has a lot of water at field capacity, it doesn't have very much that's available. It can have a lot of water in there, it can feel wet, but the plant can access it. Then the other part of the soil texture and how it influences water is how the water moves through the soil. And so here we have an experiment that was done with drip lines and a length of time at which the irrigation was turned on and where the water ended up. If we look at the sandy loam soil, you can see within a 24-hour period, the water has gone down 72 inches deep into the soil. But the water column is very narrow. On the opposite side, if we look at 24-hour period in the clay soil, it's almost half the distance down deep into the soil. Look at how wide that water has kind of moved in the water column. It's much wider. So if you have a more sandy loam soil and you're putting your drip irrigation, you want to put those drip lines much closer together compared to a clay loam soil or more clay soil. You don't need to have your drip lines as close together because the water is going to move out. But you do need to know that you have to run the irrigation maybe a little bit longer period of time to get that deep penetration to encourage those roots to go deeper into the soil compared to sandy loam where that water quickly moves down through the soil profile. Then it's important also to understand the kind of chemical makeup of the irrigation water, depending on where you're pulling that water from. Understanding the pH, because the pH of the water can also affect what's going on in the soil. So it's important to ensure that the pH is adjusted properly as well as the alkalinity. Then dissolved solids is important to understand as well. That can affect some of what is going to be built up within the soil. And lastly is electrical conductivity. If you live somewhere near the coast, understanding the water that's there and maybe a well and ensuring that it does not have a high electrical conductivity, because that's also known as an EC measurement. And that's essentially a measurement of how much salinity is within the water. And a really high salinity water then makes it difficult for that plant to take up nutrients. So knowing those numbers and then doing things to adjust them so they get ideal is important. Then also understanding the soil and air temperature. This little diagram shows kind of the difference between bare ground and mulched within a high tunnel. And you can see that the peaks of the bare ground kind of really drastically shift much more than the temperature in that soil of the mulched soils. So even though one would think, well, it's, if you use, let's say, a black plastic or you use a darker compost mulch on there, that would absorb much more of the energy from the sun and absorb that heat. What we see, though, is the shifts of much hotter and then much colder, back and forth drastic shifts. That's lessened when we use mulch within the system. The reason why that's really important is for the soil microbes. Soil microbes are what make nutrients available to our plants if we're not actively, say, fertigating or fertilizing them. What we really want is that steady flow of nutrients available to the plants. Well, this very simple diagram shows the difference or the effect of temperature on microbial activity. When it's super, super cold, microbes not doing much. They're kind of just hibernating. Then as the temperature increases, so does the microbial activity and as well as the nutrients being released. Then you get to a point at around 100 degrees Fahrenheit where everything stops. Microbes die, they cease to exist, or they dry up, or they just hibernate because it's just too hot. And you'll see this drastic drop off of their activity, which would be a drastic drop off of nutrient availability as well. Not to mention that 100 degrees Fahrenheit is probably not too great for your plant crops either. They don't like it that hot. And so organic matter, ensuring that you are doing everything you can to build the organic matter is important because that is the fuel for the microbial community, which then leads to more nutrients being released to the plants. But too much of a good thing can happen. You can increase your organic matter so much that it can lead to a host of problems. So it is important to do it on a slow pace, get those microbes to be able to slowly incorporate that organic matter into the soil, because that can lead to a little bit of salt buildup if you have too much organic matter on the surface within the high tunnel, and that actually has to do with some chemical issues I'm not going to get into today. But the good thing is your loss to leaching is reduced because you're in a high tunnel. But part of that is that your nutrients stay up near the surface. And so that's kind of what leads to a little bit of that salt buildup. So it is important to ensure that every 4 to 5 years, you're taking off that plastic when you need to replace it and giving a time for some natural rainfall to push those salt ions back down deeper into the subsoil so they become less of a problem. And then, of course, if you're talking about compost, you really want to know the source. It's very important to ensure that you are getting a source of compost that is not utilizing things that could have picolinic acid compounds. Those are herbicides that have a long legacy in the soil. They can last up to 4 years. They spray them on a hayfield. They're great broadleaf herbicides for a hayfield. However, they pass through the animal after it eats it. And now if you use that manure that gets composted, it can still really wreak havoc, especially for things in the Solanaceae family, tomatoes and potatoes, especially. You get these curled up leaves, and it's not good. So they will kind of grow out of it, but you do get reduced yields. So ensuring you know where it comes from is important. But I would say that a better way to get organic matter in there is using cover crops, because that's actively growing. They're going to hold those nutrients in place within the soil. The roots do a whole lot to help curate the microbial community as well. They can help break the pathogen cycle within the soil, which is super important as well, because it's kind of like a rotating out of one crop into another. But ensure that you are using a cover crop that isn't related to the thing you're trying to rotate out of is also important, because we won't want to make what's called a green bridge. So a lot of times it's more seen in things like a soybean, and then you grow another kind of leguminous crop, and now you have an insect that likes soybeans, and then it likes that crop, and then it hangs out, and then you grow soybeans again, and that insect's there ready and waiting for the thing it likes to eat. They can hold on to nutrients, as I've said, and they can improve compaction within the soil as well. If that's been an issue, or if you're in there and you kind of maybe put the high tunnel in a place that was slightly compacted, or where you walk constantly, that sometimes you can end up with compaction. Those roots, if you get some of the cover crops that have really good penetrating power, such specifically like rye, has a very good penetration down like through subsoil, especially if you're on land that has been previously plowed. Often you can end up with plow pan or hard pan. It's an area where it's really tough to get through. They can help in breaking that up. And then adding in sunflower, millet, and mustard into a rotation, if you do start to have salt buildup, can help to mitigate some of that. If you then harvest that and move that out of the high tunnel system. You're then, because they can kind of bioaccumulate the salt and then help to remove that a little bit. And then when we're talking, another way to kind of add in some organic matter is using a living mulch. And here's an experiment they did at the University of Minnesota. And they looked at the difference between mulching with just a landscape fabric and using rye, camelina, or canola. And these are kind of living mulches that are there as they're actively growing a regular crop, a cash crop. And what they saw was that with the landscape fabric, they saw reduction in organic matter as well as loss of nitrogen. Same with the rye, they saw that go down in the soil. But with the camelina, what they saw was organic matter increased, but nitrogen actually reduced. Both canola, they saw that the actual organic matter and nitrogen both increased at the time where you were having actively growing crops. Obviously, with rye and camelina, you would still have some nitrogen that would be within that, would get released if that was a cover crop and then terminated. But this is talking about if it's used as a living mulch. And then I had kind of talked about this a little bit before in talking about microbial diversity, but both for the above ground in allowing all of these different types of plants and for the different pollinators and really helping to rotate the crops. But it's very similar for what's going on below the ground as well. We want to have diversity growing inside that high tunnel and not always growing the same thing, because that helps to curate a very balanced microbial system as well. And when we look at kind of managing soil pathogens within a high tunnel, on top of doing everything else right, it's important to understand kind of how we look at managing disease. So this is what we call a disease triangle. And on each side is a type of management. You can either manage the environment, so reducing humidity that leads to some kind of a fungal growth. You can reduce the plant host, so don't grow the thing that pathogen likes, and that helps in managing it, or get rid of the pathogen altogether. And so if you take any one of these sides of the triangle and reduce it, you reduce the disease. But if you take and manage all of them and really focus on reducing all of them, you can really reduce disease a lot more. And so you kind of, if I were to say, like with the case of a high tunnel, we're often helping control the environment, we're helping reduce the disease. So it's important to understand what thing would contribute to the growth of a pathogen or a pest, and ensuring that you are managing that in the way that you think about how you manage your environment, or how you rotate out, or what crops you're growing that help to reduce that disease pressure within there. And there are some different ways to do that other than just crop rotation. Some people have done the movable high tunnel, although I've heard that's a little bit difficult. We did that at University of New Hampshire, ended up with some seriously hydrophobic soils, and it's not as easy to move, but it can be done, and I think just takes a little planning. Then there's solarization, which can take clear plastic and put down, and that can lead to helping to reduce the pathogen pressure, as well as fumigation. But there's the fumigation that's the non-sustainable type, and then there is what we call an anaerobic fumigation technique, which is actually using microbes as well as kind of a fuel source like a molasses, and you are flooding the soil, putting a plastic over it, and allowing the microbes to actually anaerobic microbes to actually kind of reduce the pathogen pressure. And so that's some area of new research that I think is proving to be beneficial. And so when we reduce all of the things, we really can reduce that triangle. And then looking at disturbance, we really want to ensure we don't disturb the soil too much, but if sometimes, we have to do a little bit. But when we disturb the soil, we infuse that soil with oxygen and reducing the organic matter that's built up in there. So if we can really look at reducing it as well as reducing tillage, it's also important because we want to kind of leave the home of the microbes intact. And every time we go and till, we're breaking up their home. And it also leads to reduction in soil aggregates. That's kind of like these natural little clods that hold together really well in water. And so when you get a lot of water in there, you end up still allowing more water to be able to infiltrate. It is a sign of a healthy soil. As I talked about, that root infiltrate or interception for phosphorus, this is the other way that root can actually get phosphorus. It can create a symbiotic relationship with arbuscular mycorrhizae fungi, and that fungi is able to actually actively grow further out. It reaches much farther into the soil, grabs those phosphorus, brings that over in exchange for a little bit of carbohydrate. And so the plant invests a little bit of its currency in the form of carbohydrate in order to make the exchange for some nutrients. And so it has been shown that both nitrogen, phosphorus, as well as potassium can be exchanged within this kind of hyphal network. And then looking at ways to no-till within a high tunnel, I think it's certainly much easier than maybe if you're on 100 acres to do no-till in a vegetable system. You can do it with raised beds. Perhaps you're putting down some cardboard and doing some sheet mulching to create permanent raised beds. And I think certainly there are ways to be able to terminate that crop fairly easy within a high tunnel. And so to build soil health, in conclusion, first and foremost, know the type of soil you have. You got to know what you're dealing with, to know what management decisions you need to make to be able to adjust and make the right choices for the situation that you're in. Moisture is so important to ensure that the nutrients are available, but of course, too much water is also bad. So managing that as best you can is going to be a key to ensuring consistent growth. And then temperatures, ensuring that we all talk about high tunnel. This time of year is very beneficial because it keeps it warm, but in the summer, doing things to help keep it cool in there is going to be important for the microbial community and the health of that soil. In building the organic matter, because that's the bank account for all of the nutrients that are there that can be recycled. Rotating the crops for disease management is so important. If you continually grow the same crop in the same space, and even if you rotate from, say, tomato to eggplant or pepper, they're all in the same family. The pathogens all like the same family. So perhaps rotating out and putting something different in that for a year or two, even better, 3. Or even if it's just 1 year out and then you're cover cropping in between, that's going to really break up that pathogen cycle. Really being aware of the salt buildup and addressing the issue before it becomes a major problem. And then dealing with disturbance and compaction by not driving over there, keeping permanent paths within there instead of just the whole thing walking around. There are things to be considered, because if you compact the soil, the roots have a tougher time accessing the nutrients, and the water has a tougher time infiltrating. So with that, I am going to end and take questions from, if there are any.
Thank you. So we do have one question from Molly. How did moving your high tunnel lead to hydrophobic soils?
Oh, it was actually the high tunnel had sat over one area. So the soils within that particular space where the high tunnel was so dry before it got moved off. And so then it took a long time for us to be able to wet the soil, because in a rainstorm, what would have happened was, in fact, the water wouldn't have gone in the soil at all. It just would have run off, which likely would have led to erosion as well. And so what we found was we actually had to wet the soil first before moving the high tunnel off. And not just being like, oh, well, it's going to rain, so we'll just move the high tunnel off and let Mother Nature fix it. In actuality, we had to wet the soil first before letting Mother Nature at it.
That sounds good. I've dealt with the same issue with some movable tunnels. So I have a question. I've played around with cover crops in high tunnels, and you're certainly dealing with a special situation given how you're going to irrigate and how is the tunnel structured and how tall are the sides. And I tend to like some of the smaller, low-growing cover crops, but I was curious what have been some of your favorite cover crops to put in a high tunnel?
Well, I'm kind of a fan of a mix of things, but obviously the things that are going to be easy to terminate is important, right? Because I mean, you can put a silage tarp in there and you can terminate it, but I probably not put Sudan grass in a high tunnel. That might be a little bit of a problem. I mean, unless you have a super high tunnel and you don't mind going in there with a weed whacker to take it down. I mean, granted, you have if you have the ability to maybe feed that to, you know, an animal or something, you could go in there and like use a scythe and take it down. As long as you stay away from the edges, you can puncture your plastic. But I like mixes instead of doing just like a monoculture cover crop, because I think the mixes have a lot of benefits to things. But obviously, like if you're going to use buckwheat, it's like, oh, well, make sure you terminate the stuff at the right time, right? Because then you, as I've had the issue with buckwheat becoming a weed. So you end up like, oh, it flowered, and then you're not really paying attention. And the next thing you know, you have buckwheat seeds, and it's like, oh, look, buckwheat is continually coming up in my cash crop now. But there are so many different types of cover crops out there that I think finding the right mix for your system. And then also the type of cover crop at this type of time of year too, right? Depending on where you are, can play an important role of when you're going to put the cover crop in, right? And whether it likes hot temperatures or cold temperatures is also an important consideration.
Yeah. I got in a little over my head one time and did sunflowers to mitigate some salt issues, and a 30 by 96 high tunnel and beautiful sunflowers. And then it was ready to terminate and get all of that biomass out of the tunnel. Thankfully, I had a farmer who had a big root rake that he came out and helped me get all the biomass out. But I was not prepared for how much was actually going to be in there to be pulled out. So.
Oh yeah. I've often thought about, I think sunflowers would be great if you could sell them as cut flowers. You sell them as cut flowers, but yeah, sunflowers can make some serious like root mass.
Yeah.
Maybe just grow them in the middles.
Right. All right. I don't see any more questions coming through. I thank you so much for coming and presenting. This was all really great information. I think we could all stand to learn more and more about soil health, especially in these tunnels. So thank you for being here, and thank you everyone for coming and listening to the presentation. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, everyone, take care.
Bye.